I said to myself, if I can go 6 months in a row and make as much money each month as I did when I had a full-time job, then I know I'm stable and I'm going to buy a sports car. And I thought that I would miss a month and then start the 6 month clock over again. I thought it'd be years before I would ever be able to buy this car. So 6 months later, I bought that car because I did not spend a single month missing. And that taught me a lesson. The lesson is when you stay within the system is just designed to extract the most benefit out of you and pay you the least.
Welcome to The Wild Show with your hosts, Will Chang, Lee Chang, and Andrew Su. Hi, this is Will Chang, and as always, I have my co-host Lee Chang with me.
Hey, Will. Good to be on.
Today, we are joined by Julian Chan, an entertainment attorney in private practice with an incredibly diverse clientele. A few of his clients include a billion-dollar internet retail company, internet businesses, best-selling authors, film production companies, and the North and South American representative of the Shaolin Temple. Julian is one of the most colorful and interesting people I have ever met. The first time I met him, he explained to me why and how he has so many porn star friends that he used to know. And the second time we met, he gave me a tour of an incredible Hollywood mansion that his client turned into a TikTok influencer content house. The decisions Julian has made and the path he has taken is unlike anything I've ever seen. And we'll be diving into that today. Welcome, Julian.
Thank you, Will. Thank you, Lee. Pleased to be here. I had a very interesting conversation with my father a long time ago, which I think is a little bit of an interesting tone. My father's from Hong Kong. As a background, his grandfather came to build the railroads in the 1880s in San Francisco and saved enough money to buy a farm. But because Chinese people were not allowed to own a farm, a Caucasian family had to own it for him. And when the earthquake came, he says, I'm getting out of here. And they sold the farm and he took it and bought a village in Dongguan in southern China. And the family lived there. He had his son educated as a doctor. And then when World War II happened, they fled to Hong Kong. And my father was born in Hong Kong, but his two sisters were born in China. And when I was talking to him about what it is to be Chinese, he says, when you watch TV, you get an impression. But TV is written by a certain group of people with a certain agenda. What China is much broader than that. You might think from some shows that Chinese are very conservative. And yet we're the largest Chinese in every single country in the world. You go to Missouri, you'll find a Chinese restaurant. So on one hand, we might be portrayed as very limited or not original or not risk takers. And yet on the other hand, if you look at what really happened, we've been some of the people taking the biggest risks in the world, not even knowing the language and going to Peru and setting up a Chinese restaurant or whatever, right? And there's something like 150 million Chinese outside of China. And so the backdrop of that is we write our own history. We define who we are. There will be many people defining who our race is, our culture, our religion, our gender is. But at the end of the day, we define ourselves. And we must always remember that despite what other people try to define us as, we are who we define ourselves. And that's sort of a little bit of how I've come to where I've come, as strange as it might sound. So where would you like me to start? I could also just sort of start with let me just start with the beginning a little bit, okay? And then if you want me to jump forward, please just go ahead and jump me. My father started out as a math professor and discovered he couldn't afford a newborn child on that. So he took a job as a computer programmer and told them that he knew how to program a computer when he did not. Because back then they didn't have programs to teach you how to write a program. You just had to learn. But he had a PhD in math. And so he picked up a book and taught himself how to program a computer. And a couple of years later, he ended up as the CTO of the largest computer company in Europe with 50,000 employees and 10,000 directly reporting to him as CTO. And I ended up living in New Hampshire, just over the border from Boston because of taxes, and going to a high school and a kind of a rural high school and applying to college and realizing that my school didn't have the resources needed to get me into a good college. So I got a group of friends together and we formed a debate team. And New Hampshire didn't really have a debate culture. So we ended up being a debate team debating ourselves without being able to debate other high schools because they didn't have debate teams. But I founded the debate team. And then I ended up working with a local judge to do a film on the Constitution. And I did a number of things like that. I ended up going to community college because my school didn't have physics, advanced physics. So I ended up taking college classes like a community school at University of Lowell so that when I applied to college, I got into Brown. I had to make my way in a way of make my high school experience that wouldn't have existed for other people without making a chess club, making a debate society, taking classes that didn't exist at my school.
Before you move on, I just wanted to kind of dig a little bit deeper into that. When you talked about how your dad was basically a leader in a massive corporation, right? And so he must have, as a Chinese American, he must have basically acted a certain way. And I was wondering how that affected you as a child growing up? And how did you end up figuring out how to make your own way?
So actually, this is a very good story. So my father grew up with two older sisters that were 16 and 18 years older than him, right? And then his mother was 40 when he was born. So it was almost like he had three mothers. And the conversation about what is Chinese came from the conversation about sexism. And we were talking about how there's this impression of women as weak and subservient. And I was saying how that wasn't my experience in Cantonese, Hong Kong Chinese. Is it Cantonese Chinese that women are much more assertive, or is it all China? And this is where the conversation came about, that reality of a culture can be quite different than the way it's put on TV. And that women in China were not as subservient at foot binding as you would appear, right? And so there were many examples of that. And one of the famous is Song Sayo. They did a movie series about him. And in the movie, I think Michelle Yeoh or someone plays his mother, and she's a Kung Fu artist. And it ends up that's a true story, that his mother taught him Kung Fu, and he became what they call the 10 Tigers of Canton, right? But his mother was a better Kung Fu artist than he was. And so my father grew up in this family, and his mother was afraid for him to learn how to swim. She thought he would drown. So he went to the library and got a book on how to swim and taught himself how to swim from a book. And I think it was sort of little lessons like that that modeled for me my idea of what it is to be Chinese, is that you find a way. And again, if you look at sort of the culture of China, people would say, oh, the government's oppressive and everyone does what the government says. But if you look at the history of China, it's a history of rebellion, right? It's a history of people ignoring the government, telling the government that they're doing what they're going to do, and then forming family courts, family societies, whether it's mafia, triads, or whatever, but forming your own countercultural society so that you are not controlled by the man, by the authority, if you will. And so I am a product of that part of China, which is rebellious, which always finds a way, which always is resilient, which is incredibly innovative. The kind of people that go and create a Singapore and all these other countries, which when you go there, you see it as Chinese, but I mean, there's some essential element there, right? And so that's sort of the influence my father had on me. And I grew up seeing those lessons. And one of the interesting lessons that is probably useful to everyone who has kids is the definition of intelligence. And my dad said people aren't naturally intelligent. A large product of intelligence, short of, say, birth defects, comes from resilience. And when I went to Brown, it's my first time being the number third in my class in high school. Now I'm in a university where everyone is the same level or higher than me. And I got a C in math. And my dad being a math professor, that wasn't so good. And what he says is, I'm going to teach you a lesson. I want you to get the math book for next semester. And I want you to spend the next 6 weeks of Christmas break reading one chapter a week. When school starts, I don't care if you don't understand the chapter, just read it. Okay. So I read 6 chapters. And after the third chapter, I was confused. I'm reading without a teacher. I'm confused after the third chapter. I read 6 chapters. And then when school starts, I would read one chapter ahead for every 2 weeks, so that by the end of 12 weeks, I would be having read everything twice. And I went from a C to an A+. And what that taught me, what my dad was trying to teach me, is preparation. It is really a proxy for natural speed of learning. And that is sort of one of the things that I've learned. And one of the philosophies I've taken with that is that every year I try to pick up a new hobby. And if I like the hobby, I keep going. But if I don't like it, I still pick up a new hobby. So the idea is in 10 years from now, I will have 10 areas of unique experiences, whether it's playing guitar, whether it's how to lift weights and work in the gym, whether it is how to shoot guns, how to do photography, how to do epoxy resin art, how to do Kung Fu, and all these various things. And sort of that gives you a big picture into how I approach life.
While you were at Brown, so you were talking about how you made your own way while in high school to get to Brown. But I thought one thing that I wanted to ask you about was while you were at Brown, you led protests against Brown. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Oh, okay. So this is kind of fascinating. If you look at my face, I don't look very Chinese. So when I grew up, I looked much more Chinese. And I lived in areas, like rural Illinois, suburban Chicago, and New Hampshire, where the new kid was the third generation from the town. And the old kid, their family was from before the Mayflower, right? Was on the Mayflower. So I was always seen as the outsider, as the Chinese kid. And then suddenly I started looking more Caucasian. And then I show up at college at the Chinese Student Association, and they're like, why are you here? Suddenly I was like, I'm an outsider again in a different way. But when I was at Brown, I got involved with Asian American politics because it resonated with me, with the experiences I had about being Asian in very rural areas. And so justice was very important to me. And when I was there, the KKK had shown up. and was starting to do subversive things on campus. Like they had to face some students' areas. I mean, the police had been covering it up and just calling it isolating. And this turned into a protest. And then the protest expanded into things about who gets financial aid, what resources are available to minority students, Asian American students, how we're represented on campus. And that protest grew into a very big protest that ended up taking over a bunch of university buildings. And I was not exactly part of that. But when they took over the buildings, there was a group that needed to be formed to list what the demands are and list what the goal is. What is it that we want to achieve from this? And so what we did was we created a report, try to analyze the university and give recommendations on how it could improve, right? And so I was part of a group that did that. And from that report, the university ended up adopting it and eventually became income blind in their admissions process. Before they didn't. They took into account how much money you had because they had limited financial aid. They increased the number of professors that were teaching in cultures of Asia, for example, and so on. And then 2 years later, another group decided to take over the university with, I think, not very clear agenda. And they ended up all being arrested by the university. And me as a senior leader at the time, although I didn't exactly believe that specifically how they handled things, I got involved with negotiating the solution. How is it that the university arrested 300 of its own students, many of which are foreign students on financial aid, and if they get convicted of taking over a historical monument, which the university is considered historical, that they would be kicked out of the country and not be able to attend university. So someone had to come in and negotiate that, and I was part of that group. And so I became very experienced in working against the system, but also working within the system, and then also trying to reform the system. And when I went to UPenn, the same thing happened, sort of. Well, there was an Asian student union and they had just lost the will to continue. And I was approached and they said, well, how do we fix this? And I said, well, you need to get all the student groups together that are in good shape and have a group meeting about, so the Chinese students, the Taiwanese, the Korean student, get them all together and say, how do we resurrect this Asian American Pan-Asian group? And how does it work? Who's involved? And frankly, a lot of times politics are decided by who stays in the room at the end of the night, right? You get a big group together and people get tired, people leave. And then at the end of the day, when your 300 people become 10 people, that's when things get done. And that's when you find out who has the commitment. And I was one of those 10 and we helped rewrite the Constitution. We launched the Asian American Students Union at UPenn. I think they have a different name now, but that was what happened in 92. And so those lessons kind of came with me. And sort of same thing with my experience with FF. The thing about these experiences is that you learn who you can trust and who you can work with by working with them. And the best way you do that is pick something that is not life or death, right? So, instead of taking all your savings, starting a company and working with someone, you start out by doing some charity work together and see how they handled that. And then from that, who is a performer and who is off.
It's interesting you mentioned that you looked more Asian growing up. Because when I first met you, I was a bit confused. We're in this Chinese American fraternity together. And I was like, who's this guy? Like, someone described to me, I didn't say this, but someone's like, yeah, Julian's like the least Chinese looking Chinese American that I've met. At least your father's Chinese, right? And
yeah.
So I'm wondering, going back to growing up in such a rural area, it sounds like obviously you were instilled with strong values from both your mom and your dad. And you very quickly, at least in college and beyond, we know the history, and we'll get into a lot of more of your future endeavors that have to do with Asian American heritage and a lot of things that you have done. But how did that kind of come about? Were you always extremely comfortable and confident in your Chinese heritage? Or is there a story to that as well, coming into that?
So whenever there was a path to get deeper into your culture versus to fit in, myself and my father did the reverse. So for example, when he got a scholarship to go to St. Paul's co-ed as the student who is poor but intelligent. So he's the one scholarship student among 60, right? So when he was that, because when they fled the Japanese, they lost the village, they had nothing left, and all they had was their intelligence. And so my dad got the scholarship to St. Paul's co-ed, and they had a chance. You could either learn English history, or you could learn Chinese history. You could learn calligraphy, or you could learn these kind of things.
Sorry, just real quickly, that's in Hong Kong, correct?
That's in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
And so my dad consistently took the choice of learning more about China. So he learned Chinese calligraphy versus English poetry. Did he also learn English poetry? He also did. But he always took the program that loved and respected his own culture, as opposed to back then Hong Kong was like, well, we want to be more European. So people say, learn how to speak with a British accent, right? And my dad will say this, and this might upset some of my friends, but he calls those hothouse flowers, people that are trying to survive in someone else's arboretum, right? And this comes back to what is being Chinese. And Chinese is about making your own Chinese restaurant. No matter where you are, you make your own little part of China. China is where your heart is. And that's the one thing that I say when you Big Trouble in Little China, even though it's by a Caucasian director, he really understood a lot about the heart of China there, right? China is where the heart is. That's a line from the movie, right? So that kind of was with me too. So when we were living in the middle of Appleton, Bloomington, Normal, Illinois, 2 hours away from Chicago, we would get up Saturday morning, drive 2 hours and get dim sum. And then we would go see a Chinese movie. And so I was seeing Cantonese humor, the slapstick kind of humor, and then people fighting with plungers, that kind of Jackie Chan. And then we would have Chinese dinner and then drive home 2 hours, 4 hours. And then Sunday, we would wake up and do the same thing. And we would do that every Saturday and Sunday for as long as I remember. And somewhere in there, I would go to Chinese school. And the Chinese school was very interesting at that time because Chinese schools were often funded by the Taiwanese government. And so this was a way for them to kind of encourage America to look fondly on Taiwan, right? Because there was funding for their survival. So my father speaks Cantonese and they teach Mandarin, but the movies they have were very pro Taiwan. And so you would have these very interesting movies like Chinese Girls in the Army. And they had started about the 3 girls joining the Taiwanese army and how happy they were to be going and cooking dinner or whatever they were, wearing Chinese uniforms. This army never fought a war, but they all were always on the base being cheerful and whatever they were doing. And so I would come back and try to speak Mandarin. My dad was Cantonese speaker. He's like, I think you're saying it wrong. Then I go back to Chinese school and they say, no, you're saying it right. And then my dad, then we have a debate on it. And years later, when my father moved to China, he actually said he learned Mandarin from watching all the Jackie Chan movies. So that he speaks Mandarin fluently now, in addition to Cantonese. But he speaks German and the English. My experience is that where did it come from as a kid? I early on understood that it was something precious that you needed to really make a part of you, that you needed to preserve, right? And so I grew up reading The Monkey King. I think my dad made me read a book and do a book report on it. One new chapter a week when I was 7 years old, Arthur Waley's translation. And at the same time, he made me read Sense of Man and Cosmos by Carl Sagan. You got to think of this, an 8-year-old kid being forced to read this on summer break. It's a miserable experience, but teaching someone a basic book about how science has created humanity or how the cosmos is structured, that's giving you a big picture. And that's sort of something I'm very happy both my parents gave to me. My mother was Jewish. Her family came over during World War II and they ended up in Montreal. So they're English speaking minority in Montreal. And somehow she chose my father. And when my father says, I'm leaving McGill because they don't give me enough of a scholarship and Wake Forest has offered me a full scholarship, she went with him, dropped out of college and went to North Carolina where they graduated. And my father, when he went to get his PhD at University of Wisconsin, felt very strongly about education. So even though my mom had dropped out of college, she finished college at the University of Wisconsin and then got her master's degree in sociology. And I think that says a lot about the relationship and the idea that Chinese men don't respect their wives or education. They want their wives to be subservient. I mean, my father is an example of that. And when I asked if he was somehow different or extraordinary, he says, no, there are many people in China, outside of China, whatever, who have these values that are different than the way it's presented in the media, but is representative of what China is. China is bigger than just one storyline, right? And we have to paint the storyline together. We have to paint our story of who we are, regardless of our race.
The other half of, I think, the story at Brown or even UPenn is there's the Chinese, Asian, American part, but also the justice, negotiation, like law part, right? Have you always been interested in law? How did you end up getting into law?
Oh, gosh, great question. So I had been interested both in science. I'd always read science fiction books. I always wanted to be like Elon Musk and design space engines. And then the other part of me was very interested in justice. And when I was in high school, I was offered an opportunity to work with a judge to do a move thing on the Constitution. And I think that helped get me into college. We were working with a federal judge. And then I wrote a paper about injustice in America. And I looked through the history of America and I said, America is based on injustice, but it's also a story about injustice being overcome, that women couldn't vote, but now they could vote. Slaves existed, now they exist. We have a history of all these different things. I did it all the way back from the 16th century. And then I charted how, despite all of our flaws, there was a progression towards more and more rights. And if you look at it, we have the same thing now. We have sexual rights, gender rights, even age rights. Like we're looking more at, do gay people have rights? Do transgender, do children, should they have more rights? Right. So there's an upward flow towards freedom and equality in America. And so I think the negative of America is sometimes we deceive ourselves as to where we are. The positive is that there's an upward progression with an occasional backslip here and there, right? When I went to Brown, I was a physics major and I had that math. And then I started getting migraine headaches. And I realized I don't think I could be an engineer with migraine headaches. I get about 180 migraine headaches a year back then, something called cluster migraine headaches. And I had them for decades. And I was unable to function for 4 hours a day. And I said, well, okay, if I can't be an engineer, I could be a lawyer working for these companies. I could help Boeing get approvals for space launches. I could be on the planning side rather than on the engineering side. And after law school, I found, unfortunately, the aerospace industry was in a slump. And so my father had started a software company and said, why don't you join? And so I went from an engineer to wanting to be a lawyer for engineering companies like aerospace, and then being a lawyer for a technology company. And that's sort of how it drifted. And then how did I end up in entertainment? Well, software became websites, and websites became video games, and video games became influencers. And then it all came back together because your film and TV and everything is now in some version of a game or on social media, right? It's all kind of software. And so you see how there's an evolution. And in some ways, this comes to the discussion about porn. Okay. So I'll jump to that. So I'll tell a little bit of a story prologue up to this. So when I graduated from law school, aerospace was a slump, and my dad had started a software company fixing system software maintenance. So large mainframes have a software, and when they build the next platform, they ignore the old one, and insurance companies who are on it still need to maintain it. So they need system software support. So my dad started his company. My mom says, I don't trust the CFO. So I want you to go work for your dad and watch his back. And so I was, in my dad's company in Boston, and this is 95. And one of our clients, MetLife, comes to us and says, we have this thing called the year 2000 problem. And these tools you developed seem to work. And can we pay you to develop the tools further? And if so, can we license the technology from you? And then MetLife became our first client for the year 2000 problem. And the CIO, Chief Information Officer, said, I believe in this so much, I'm going to quit my job and I'm going to become your vice president of sales. And I'm going to introduce you to all my friends. So our next client became Merrill Lynch, and then AT&T. And then we licensed our software to CSC, IBM, and Tata's, and we just grew like crazy. And we went from, when I joined, 30 people to 500 people and $500,000 in revenue to 40 million in revenue. And suddenly we were public on NASDAQ after raising 7 million from Greylock and Matrix and 7 million in another round from Summit Partner. And that doesn't sound like anything today, but back in 95, that was a lot of money. Okay. And we went public on NASDAQ with a $500 million valuation, which again, doesn't sound like much today, but back then was quite a lot. And they were public, and suddenly we had offices in 5 different locations. We had all these employees, 500 employees when I left. And I was there for a year after it was public. And I just was like, this is not the same experience. I want to go back and work with startups. I want to start an incubator. I want to take all the people I know that didn't make a whole lot of money when it went public, but have the experience and get involved in incubating companies. And so that led me to LA, because I thought San Francisco is the pipes, but the things that will go through the pipes will come from LA, right? And 24 years ago, that's what you see now. You see all the game companies coming down here. You see Google coming down here. But back then it was a little too early for its time. Okay. So I came to LA, and Hans Zimmer had started a website company to build websites for the movie studios. And I'm very close to my father, and my father was still at the company that he had founded. And I was running this incubator with his blessing. And we were talking, and he was getting tired of working at his company too. And he was in the process of exiting. And we ran across Hans Zimmer, and he came up with this idea. Why don't we find all the little mom and pop website companies that have 3 or 4 or 5 million in revenue? Yeah, the one in Cleveland, the one in Des Moines, the one in Wisconsin, who can never go public. And let's roll them up into one giant company. And let's tap on with Hans Zimmer's company, because now this guy in Cleveland can say that they worked on Spider-Man and Charlie's Angels and all these first-class movies. And then they can charge a higher rate. And now you got a $50 million company or $100 million company with all these together. Okay. And that was sort of the genesis of the idea of Univescent Digital Studio. Okay. And Media Revolution was Hans' company. And so when we were in the process of taking it over, I was installed as the COO and general counsel of the LLC trying to integrate it. And then that's when we were talking to our friend who was advisor to the board of Sega, a guy named PK Show. And Sega said, you know what? We've been trying to go into China for all these years, but we keep failing because we're not Chinese and they hate us, which we And they like distribute games in China. We can't figure out how to outsource our software development. And so the idea came together. We had another group of people. So my father had gone to a high school reunion and found out that a whole bunch of his classmates at St. Paul's had founded public companies, Veritronics, Global Crossing. I'm trying to remember the technology that is the Gemstar, which when you open up your TV box and you see the menu, that's Gemstar technology, the menu system for your cable box. And we all formed an incubator, put money in, and we're incubating our ideas. And so we had all these different connections. One of the guys in China, Wilson Chong, said, you know what? There's all these distribution companies in China that distribute games, but they have the same situation. There's one in each city, but they don't, they're all mom and pops. So we went to China and rolled them all up into a giant company. And that's how we went to all these employees and the 300 million in revenue. We rolled all these companies that were selling games. And when I say selling games, I mean they were printing them on CDs and then selling them out of a little store. Okay. And eventually they started selling them to internet cafes. They would make an arrangement with the internet cafe. And then as the internet got faster, they made deals to host online games. And we got bigger and bigger and bigger. But this was sort of the state of where we were and what we were trying to do. Right. And so this is 1997, 98 now. So I want you to think of what's happening then. Yahoo has just gotten started. Google doesn't exist. Okay. The internet is 28K modem speed. Okay. So I want you to imagine that a little video frame, 128 pixel by 80 pixel, refreshes itself every 30 seconds. Okay. That's how fast the internet was. Okay. And back then, Yahoo's like, it's a phone book. You press a button, it's going to bring up a bunch of links. There's no pictures because pictures take too long to load, right? So Google didn't even exist, right? So we're running this incubator and we're in LA and I meet with a guy from a video streaming company. And I said, interesting technology. We think the internet will get faster. What companies will succeed when the internet is faster? And so I was exploring it. And the guy says, you know what? We don't make any money from this. No business will pay for video conferencing with a little clip this big that refreshes every 30 seconds. But he says, we have a secret division and we license it and it keeps the money on. So we license it to porn companies because people will pay $10 a month to see a little clip refresh itself because they don't want to go into their local Osco Drugs or their local CVS and try to buy the X-rated magazine from behind the counter or go to Blockbuster and go in that little room. They would live with that little clip. Okay. Do you want to come to a meeting and meet all the technology folks that are doing this? They said, oh, that sounds interesting. And so I realized I go to this meeting and there's a guy that says, yeah, this is how you verify IP address. You know who is on the other end of the video link. This is how you do credit card verification. This is how you host a website. This is how you do video streaming. So all these guys weren't making any money, but they were the cutting edge of the industry. The only people paying them were porn people. And I realized to know how the future of technology, you have to go where the greatest desire is. And sexuality is one of the strongest pulls. People will spend money on it when it doesn't make any sense anywhere else. And you see that with virtual reality, right? And so I went to these meetings and there were a number of porn stars there that were the clients. And a couple of them said, hey, you seem to understand all of this. That guy only understands that. That guy only understands that. But you seem to understand all of it. Can I take you to lunch? Can you explain it all to me? Tell me which of those guys I should hire. And so that's why I started meeting some of the porn stars. And interestingly enough, I convinced one of the porn stars to let me tag her website to see how people behave on her website. And it was interesting. And this is where I got to human behavior, right? People would go to the page and see all the X-rated pictures and download all the pictures. The first day they sign up, download it. Then the next day they come back to see if there's any new changes. And then next day, no changes. And then they would realize it doesn't change that often. So they come back once a week. Then they would discover her chat room, which is there's nothing to see. It's just like a chat room because pictures are too slow. So think of it as like Twitch right now, but just no pictures. And people would just chat. You don't know who you're chatting with, right? So it's like OnlyFans, right? Okay. I would see how people would behave. And it was very interesting because you would see that some people would stay for 6 months and they would eventually end up in the chat room and they would constantly come back and chat. And they would chat both with the model, but with other people in the room. They formed friendships that way. And they stayed for at least 6 months. They would quit, come back 2 months later, and stay for another 6 months. And then you had a whole bunch of people that would join for 1 month, download all the pictures and disappear. And you realize the value is in the people that stayed for 6 months. They are 6 times more valuable than the one that come and disappear, right? So then I said, well, why are people doing this? Okay. So the porn model said, hey, I have to go on a vacation. I need you to take over. I said, what do you mean take over? They don't see my face anyways. I just want you to go in and just be me for a week while I'm on vacation. So I said, okay, but I need to see what you do. So I watch what he does. He goes there and he says, some guy comes on, some new person joins on and says, oh my God, I just want to have crazy sex with you, blah, blah, blah. And she says, don't talk to me that way. I'm not a prostitute. I'm a person. Even though I do this, I'm still a person. Treat me like a lady. Okay. And so I watched that and that guy became a regular member. Then when I had it come in, some new person joined. Oh my God, I just want to do all these nasty things to you. The first guy said, don't talk to her that way. She's a lady. I saw that she created the culture. And this goes back to you define who you are, right? Other people try to define you, but at the end of the day, you define your reality by being strong in who you are, right? That's lesson from before, kind of repeating itself. But the second lesson is that all these people are looking for connection. They may only be able to express it in terms of gross sexuality, because as men, we're not allowed to talk about our feelings, right? So we're not allowed to care about a woman's feelings. So we just got to say, oh, she's got a great body. Our friends historically make fun of us. Oh, you like her. Oh my God, what's wrong with you? So you have to talk in crass measure, and that's how you learn. But the reality is these are proxies for why do you go to a strip club? Not because you really want to look at them naked, it's because you want to sit down and have someone come talk to you. And so once you get in touch, what you're really looking for, what really makes you happy in life, then you can sort of wipe away all these things that were put on us because of all the restrictions. The men can't be vulnerable because they'll be attacked by other men, right? Once you put aside those fears, we can actually find the connection that to each other and to what makes us happy, right? Which is deep interpersonal relationships, right? Okay.
One of the things that you mentioned, I thought I just wanted to bring up one more time, is how porn drives technology. And you do see that over time, right? Whether it's like the DVD versus Blu-ray, whether it's virtual reality. I think porn's, yeah, like you said, I think online payments was started with porn. And so it's really interesting just hearing you kind of live that life, seeing that actually play out in action in terms of like porn and sexuality driving technology and being able to kind of see the future by seeing where porn goes. I think the second thing that is quite interesting too is what you described when it comes to video and community 10, 15 years ago is happening today with like Twitch and OnlyFans and all these like basically like the technology is catching up to like that human desire. Before we get into like what the current work that you do today with influencers, because it sounds like it's just a continuation of what you were doing with porn. Can you talk a little bit about Neil Strauss?
Great. No, this is actually a very fascinating subject. So Neil Strauss came to me, found my website, called me up and said, I really like what you're doing with the civil rights. I said, great. He says, I really want to hire you to be my lawyer. I said, well, why? Don't you have a lawyer already? Because you're quite famous. And he says, well, yes, but I want to write a book about how to make $1 million and I want to start from scratch. So I'm not using any of my connections. And I'm seeing if I can make $1 million from scratch, if it's a repeatable process or is there just luck involved? And so one of it is to pick a new lawyer. And so he started talking about how he loves all the work I was doing with lesbian gay rights. And I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, I'm not really doing anything with lesbian gay rights. I mean, I'm doing a lot with Asian American rights, but I'm not really like nothing that would stand out to say that I'm like an icon here. So while he's talking to me on the phone, I'm pulling up Google and I'm Googling my name. And I find out the #1 gay rights activist in Hong Kong is Julian Chan. And there's the picture of him is leading 100,000 people down the streets and he's taking down the government. He's on the ban list from the Chinese government. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm supposed to go to China next week. I have the same name as this guy. He's on the ban list. I'm going to show up at Neil Strauss. They're not going to know it's not me. I'm going to end up arrested. So I was a little worried, but I said to Neil, I said, gee, do I just tell him, yes, I'd love to be your lawyer? Or do I tell him I'm not that guy? And so I told him I'm not that guy, but he says, I still like what you're doing now that you're telling me what you've done. And so he hired me. And it was very interesting because he had written the game about pickup artists and he had sort of this reputation of being a pickup artist. And I had not read his book. I didn't know anything about his book. I had not heard about him at all. Right. And so a year and a half goes by and at some point decided I need to read his book. Okay. So I go into a bookstore in Chicago and I'm reaching to pick the book off the shelf. It's like a black Bible. As I reach it, another hand grabs it out of my hand. And it's this most incredibly beautiful woman. And I'm like, what is going on here? She says, no, you have to let me. That's the last copy. My circle of girlfriends need to read this book because we want to protect ourselves from this mentality. So you need to let me have the book. And so I ended up on a date with her. This book worked so well. I didn't even read it, but I ended up getting a date.
Julian, real quickly, if you can tell for those listening that don't know what book we're talking about or who Neil Strauss is, I'm guessing this is The Game, right? But
this is The Game. Yeah, this is the book called The Game, Penetrating the Society of Secret Pickup Artists. Okay. And so I finally got a second copy from a different bookstore and read the book. And I called up Neil and I said, Neil, this book doesn't teach you anything about how to pick up people. It starts out by talking about what kind of crazy people would want to learn to be pickup artists. It starts with you trying to get a guy who's suicidal to come out of the bathroom because he locked himself in. And it concludes with half the people that you describe becoming monogamous or celibate or joining a monastery in one case. Like this seems to be saying the exact opposite about how to be a pickup artist, saying that you should not want to. And Neil said, yeah, that's the secret. He says, if I wrote a book saying how to be a better person, like if you read the book, he's like, well, how do you be a better person? How do you pick up women? Well, you go and dress better, and make sure you're clean, wash your hair, learn what women like to talk about and understand what they feel and learn how to talk about the subjects, learn how to approach people without making them feel uncomfortable and how to leave before you become unwelcome. And he said, yeah, I'm just teaching people how to be better human beings. But if I did a book saying that's what it's about, no one will buy it. And this comes back to kind of leading with porn, right? How do you teach people to be better people? You start out with their desire to, I want to get laid. But the reality is, it isn't about that. And so it's funny how many people have judged Neil Strauss based on the title without ever having read the book. And then everyone who's read the book has said, this is an eye opener. It has really made me a better person. And that's sort of the big picture here is if you want to start a new business, you need to get people that will open your book without even knowing what it says, and get you a date without even pulling it off the shelf, right? And if you look something like TikTok is actually Vines. You remember Vines back in the day?
Yeah.
1 minute videos?
Yeah.
And TikTok is what, 30-second videos? I mean, is it really any different? No, not really, right? Maybe it added a couple of tools on, but people didn't come for the tools. They came for the tools are just nice things, but it came because it was something that we loved. And then YouTube made a mistake and blew it up. And I'll talk about all the mistakes that Google made if you want, why they're not that smart. I call it the triple Yahoo mistake, and I go through these if you want. But if you look at TikTok, usually it's a lot of sexy people singing a song or doing a little dance. And it is appealing back to your porn interest, if you will, although it's not porn, but it is appealing to the same kind of interest, right? Attraction to other people. And I come back to, it's not about sex. Porn is not about sex. Porn is about people who can't express the fact that they want connection, and a crude way of doing it. But all of this is about us wanting connection. And these little clips are about creating instant connection. So when you see people being cute or doing Aekyo or K-pop, it's about an elevator speech. You know how they talk about when you do a pitch for a company, you have a 30-second elevator pitch. You're in an elevator, you have 30 seconds before they leave. You get them interested in investing in your company. All these things are about doing an elevator pitch of who you are and what makes you unique as a person. And TikTok is maybe the ultimate expression of that, right?
I just find it fascinating because from what you're telling us about your history and all these things that you've done, it's interesting that the way that you approach a lot of these opportunities or seeing some of the disconnect, say you're working in a porn industry where perhaps a lot of people would think that it is about selling sex, and partially it is, but coming back to the human element and how that is something that perhaps is not as apparent to others. And coming back to kind of that sense of understanding about yourself and how that has manifested in your success over the years. I'm curious too, and kind of circling back to perception, how do you feel like people have perhaps misjudged you? Or when people are working with you, has that also shaped kind of that awareness for you? Or how does that come about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the first is people don't perceive me as Asian at first. And it's really funny because I have a certain group of friends that say, wow, you look very Asian to me. I think they're crazy, but I have come over time to realize they actually think that. And it's because their mind has gotten to know me well enough
Right.
that how I think that I fit in their mind. Okay. And then my girlfriend, who's Chinese, she's like, you don't look Asian at all. I don't think of you that way at all. And then it's very interesting because you see my father, if you see a picture of my father, people say I look like my father. And they say he looks very Chinese. And yet I don't look Chinese, but I look like him. And so this comes back to, I think, what they call cognitive dissonance. Some small thing in your mind, like if you look at my eyes, it's the same as my father, my eyebrows, my shape of my face. Many Chinese people have it. There's maybe just one or two items that are different, maybe the shape of my mouth or my nose. They're like, oh, you must have a Jewish nose. And my mom's nose doesn't look remotely like mine. I mean, I broke my nose, so it's a broken nose. It's what a broken nose looks like. It's not like a Jewish nose. So I think that that's one. And then people perceive because I'm small or because I'm mild-mannered that I am not strong of character. And then when I'm working and my friends hear me on the phone working, they are often very shocked because people have only met me by phone are afraid of me. Like I've once had a client and the CFO literally ran out of the building when she heard I was coming. I was just like, I didn't understand why. I said, oh, she's afraid of you, the CEO said. And I've had that a couple of times. People say that a lot of people are afraid of you on the phone, but then once they meet you in person, they get where you're coming from and they're not afraid. And I'm like, well, how am I different on the phone? I don't know. The minute they see me, they're not afraid. But on the phone, I guess I have a very different mannerism. I don't know. People interpret the way they want to. And this is sort of the big thing. People have frames of reference and they'll put a frame of reference on you. And it's very hard for them to really see reality.
This goes back to, what we started with, right? Like the perception of Chinese, Asian Americans and what is portrayed in media versus what is reality. And we have these preconceptions that we will default to. And it's very easy for us to overlook others or opportunity based on that. And I think this is a great reminder of that fact.
I love seeing these videos of people that are ethnically Chinese, but they grow up never learning Chinese, never liking their culture. And then I see these people that are blonde, that their parents moved to China and they grew up in China and they only speak Cantonese and they're Chinese food. And I'm like, well, who is more Chinese? And is it genetic or is it cultural? And I think of it as it's self-identification. If you identify, that is the most important thing. Genetics, honestly, someone who's Korean versus Chinese, the borderline is very thin. Is someone more Chinese because they're from Sichuan versus one side of the border with Korea? It's very arbitrary when you really think about it, right? But it really is, how do we identify ourselves? What culture do we put ourselves to? And even culture is wide. Even the American culture, Texas culture is very different than culture in Maine, right? Versus Oregon, right? So culture has to be seen as flexible enough, but still defined enough. So it has to be some essential elements that you think of as what your culture is, right? So America, we often think of things like our constitution, right? Our freedom of religion, right? In China, I think it is sort of in my mind, is things like our willingness to try to experiment with new things and try to work around the system and within the system and not be ruled by the system. Whereas I think outside, they think, oh, China is the CCP. And I was like, no, the history of China is avoiding the emperor, avoiding the Qing dynasty. They're foreigners, right? They're not even Chinese. The Qing dynasty is not even Chinese. And the Yuan dynasty, Mongolians, are not even Chinese, right? And the whole bring back the Ming, down with the Qing, bring back the Ming, right? All the Kung Fu movies are about Chinese hating their own government, right? And ignoring it and trying to doing their own thing. And I think if you remember, they used to show Kung Fu movies on Saturday morning. You guys might be just a little bit young for that. But all these groups like the Wu-Tang Clan, right? Where do they come from? And there is an intimate connection because even though people have perceived Chinese men as weak, but then you have Bruce Lee, right? So this is really fascinating because the history of it for Black African Americans is they do not see Chinese as weak. Why? Because they grew up seeing Kung Fu movies and thinking, I want to be that guy taking on the man. And Shaft and all those characters are imitations of Chinese role models. So Chinese role models are the role models for African-American society, hence the Wu-Tang Clan, right? Isn't that kind of fascinating?
Yeah, very fascinating.
African-Americans are kind of viewed by, WASP culture, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture, as the tough guys in America. And they view Chinese as the tough guy because there's Bruce Lee, right? That's the one that Kareem Abdul-Jabbar will take lessons from, right? So again, this comes back to what is the culture, what is the frame, right? So Neil Strauss has been very interesting in that. He has his own frame problems, have him as a pickup artist, right? And yet the number one book right now is The Creative Process with Rick Rubin. You look on it inside, he's the co-writer, right? And I love Rick Rubin, but Neil is my friend. And I always say, Neil has 10 books on the New York Times bestsellers list, Kevin Hart. And not all these books are books about other people. A lot of the books are about his own life, like The Truth or The Game or Survival. And all these became bestsellers. And so to be able to write a book on the creative process, I think he's fighting against his frame. And if I say there's somebody you should read, you should definitely read Neil Strauss' books, because no matter what the subject is, they all are about a human being inside and what makes that person that person. What makes Kevin Hart? What lessons did he learn in his life? There's an extraction that kind of distills the essence of what someone has achieved in their life. And it's really well worth reading, whether it's on the creative process or why survivalists become survivalists or how to be in a happy marriage or how to learn to get into a relationship. Right? We're all struggling with our frame, right? And again, the more that we are willing to bend our frame, one new hobby a year. One of my hobbies is learning Korean. Half my girlfriends really hate that. They're like, why are you learning Korean? We're Chinese. I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why. I listen to a lot of K-pop, so it's easy to hear it all the time. And my Korean friends may not like to hear this. Korean is easier to learn than Chinese. And I was not confident in my ability to do language. So I said, I will take an easier language first, and then I will learn a harder language like Chinese.
You may have covered this already, but I wanted to ask again just to make sure. Earlier, we talked about, before the podcast, your philosophy on human emotions and being able to biohack them. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. One of my clients is Andrew Huberman. People are following him because he talked about
Big
biohacking,
fan.
right?
Yeah, everyone in Silicon Valley right now is all about Huberman.
Yeah. And he's a great speaker and very eloquent. And, he does things like if you get sunlight in the morning, then it reprograms how your body burns fat and so on, and intermittent fasting and things like that, right? So it kind of aligned with me because I was sort of thinking about those kind of issues, but more from an emotional perspective. So one day I was depressed and I felt very, very depressed. And I was trying to figure out why I was so depressed because the day before I felt the best in the world. And I did something I'd never done before. I did a self-audit. So I said, well, is my relationship with my parents good? Yeah, it's the same as yesterday. Nothing new has happened. With any friends? No. Am I feeling insecure at work? No. Am I sick? No. So I went through the whole list and there was nothing wrong. And then I looked out the window and I realized it was raining and cloudy. I'm like, it's funny. They write all the songs about rain, cloud, and depression, right? So why does rain make people depressed? And so I was thinking, okay, when we're a caveman, if it's raining and you go outside to stand in the rain, you get a cold and die. So people are not that experienced back then. So what does biology do? Biology says, I want you to go into the cave, build a fire, and huddle up. And how does it make you do that? It makes you depressed because depression sparks a certain reaction and aggression does another one. So you're hungry, you start getting aggressive, like angry, right? So if you go kill an animal and chase it down, you're more likely to do that when you're angry than when you're depressed. And when are you more likely to go into the house? When you're depressed. So I realized that this was biology trying to get you to do things for self-preservation. But if it's too strong, then you kill yourself, right? And so what I realized is you need to biohack your emotion so that you know when it's telling you to do something good for your own good and when it is going to maybe take it too far. So whenever I feel depressed, I think of it like I go through an audit. And if I figure out there's something wrong, I work on fixing that thing. If I had a fight with my parents, I go call my parents and work on it. If there is nothing that shows up in my audit, then I say, you know what? It's like the flu. The flu makes you depressed too, right? Minimize your energy. And I realized you just have to get through it. When you have the flu, you just know when you're depressed in the flu, you just have to spend the week in bed and get over it. And so I now try to figure out all my emotions. Like I see a beautiful girl and oh my God, I'm so happy. I want to meet her. I want to talk to her. And then I realize, wait a minute, that's dangerous. This is biology trying to get her pregnant and have the next generation. And the thing is, I don't know that person. She doesn't know me. If I chase after her and love bomb her, maybe she'll fall in love and we get pregnant. And then 18 months later, we're like, I don't like you anymore, but we have a kid. And so all these things are deeply programmed into us. And if we're not careful, they will lead us down a path that we regret. So we need to understand those mechanisms, how they work, and then biohack them so that we end up with a happy life.
So we could probably do a whole nother episode on this, but it's kind of a rabbit hole, right? Because I'm curious for you, Julian, in terms of how much of it doing the self-audit and going through your own mind versus have you also explored whether it's like supplementation or other means of like affecting or altering neuromodulation? What other tips and tricks in biohacking or anything of that nature are you currently practicing or that you have been looking into?
Yeah. So I'm not a fan of drugs because drugs generally are a cheat. So it's sort of like I feel bad. And instead of figuring out why I am feeling bad and work on fixing it, a lot of times like, oh, I take this pill. Now I feel good. But then you haven't solved the problem. Okay. But I think that this new study of psilocybin, MDMA, all these different things do have a place of interest. Okay. So for example, I'm not going to talk about my experience, but somewhere out there, there's somebody who has had this experience. And the report that was given to me, I don't know if you ever see Anthony Bourdain. He did this thing where he says, I'm not allowed to smoke marijuana on screen. And then there's fades off, and then there's a cloud of smoke that comes out, and then he comes back. And so I won't talk from personal experience, let's from other people's experience. But some people report that if they take a certain drug, all their fear goes away, all their insecurity goes away. Okay. And I think that's great. But I think what you need to do is be reflective about that. Like you might take that and say, okay, I'm not going to keep taking the pill so that my fear goes away. What you should do is feel what it feels like to have no fear and remember that feeling. And then when you do have fear, recognize it isn't real and also see if you mentally can imagine yourself back here. And I did used to do the following with drinking. So you drink and you get more talkative and you feel less shy about talking to strangers, right? And so I started experimenting with making myself do all those things without drinking, like mentally just saying, I'm drunk. I want to talk to you. How are you doing? Blah, blah, blah. You can see me kind of doing it right now, right? And so by creating that energy, hey, how you doing? Yeah. By creating that energy, I can put myself into that state and get all the benefits with none of the downside. And that becomes power. So why do we have insecurity? Because a lot of people try to work on getting rid of their insecurity. So they go to therapy. Why do my parents? Well, I hate them, whatever they did to me. I'm insecure because my parents, I blame them, right? So they go through all this stuff trying to get rid of their insecurity. You can't get rid of insecurity. Think about it for a minute. Just think about it from a biological perspective. What is the purpose of insecurity? Imagine you're in a cave and you're not insecure. What happens?
You put yourself in a dangerous situation and you
Right.
kill yourself.
Yeah. Self-preservation. Yeah.
The tiger eats you. You heard a twig, you didn't look over, and the tiger was there and it ate you. So insecurity is like, oh my God, do my fellow tribesmen like me? Because if they don't like me, I'm the next dinner, right? They're going to cannibalize me. So this fear about how my social standing, all this stuff was self-preservation. And the insecurity was a natural thing. But you know what? Too much of it makes you commit suicide. Too much of it makes you unhappy. And too much of it causes you to react with a defensive mentality as opposed to a builder mentality, right? So taking a pill and getting rid of it is not a good thing. But taking a pill and recognizing how much insecurity you naturally have is worthwhile. Once you know that baseline, then you need to mentally control your insecurity so that it doesn't make you unhappy. And there's a number of things. You could do small little projects to make yourself feel successful, like folding laundry. So you feel depressed or insecure, fold a little laundry. Now you have a little success. Like there are ways of biohacking your insecurity, right? Like that. Someone gave me a long list of things like this that's incredibly useful. And so this is something that I wish high schools taught, right? Even it's now going back to my story about math. I read a chapter and I didn't understand it in calculus. But then later on, when I read it the second time, it made sense to me. I wish in high school, they would teach people about emotional management, self-biohacking, the importance of exploring different ideas, right? And even if they didn't get it, they learned a lesson about how it can be done. And then later in life, when they're ready, it makes sense. And so me at 53, I'm starting to understand these things and make them work for me.
One of the things that stand out listening to your story, there's actually two things. One is your ability to reinvent yourself and adapt. Because when you first started in your career or even earlier on, like in the 90s, the technology is so different, right? And you talked about that through line in terms of connection, people wanting connection, but you started at the 128 pixels times 80 pixels, refreshing every 30 seconds to now you're talking about like in TikTok influencers, right? And so the first question I have is like, how have you been able to reinvent yourself? Because the technology is changing so fast, the laws can't catch up, right? How do you do that?
Oh, I mean, honestly, this is where Chinese excel at this, right? I mean, why did China grow so fast after communism, right? And the answer is because we had always had it in our DNA. And this is one thing I love about being Chinese, which is they always say opportunity comes out of crisis, right? Instead, like most people say the reverse. With crisis is fear. Chinese say crisis creates opportunity, right? So that to me is one essential Chinese thing, right? Which is that when the rules are not working, some people just stay with the rules. And then there's some people that break the rules. And then those people become Steve Jobs with the Napsters, right? Become the iPod, or Elon Musk and you have cars, right? Electric cars, right? So a certain willingness to learn how to experiment on the edge of the rules when technology and science is changing and make those rules no longer make sense. That is what Chinese excel at. And so growing up Chinese and learning that is where I say I have not had a fear of trying to do something different and new. Okay. And that's where it comes from. Right. And that's where sort of an incubator idea for starting new businesses is important because it exposes people to many different ideas, CFO's idea, a legal idea, engineering point of view, a marketing point of view, and they're all different. And then you come together and suddenly you have a new business. I'm not sure that quite answered your question.
Well, so it did halfway, but then the other half is like, how have you been able to establish yourself as technology changes as the person to go to basically solve these problems, right?
I mean, I think that the answer is that despite the fact that the subject matter changes, whether it's software or music or film or TV, the approach has to be the same, right? Which is to look at the underlying assumptions and then look at what has changed and then say what happened now that all the assumptions are different. What is the basic core of human beings that they're seeking? What is the porn part, right? What is the desire? And again, porn is not sexuality, it's connection, right? What it is about the creative process, the hobbies, TikTok. It's all about connection. So you have to look at all these technologies and say, well, how is it improving connection? And the more you improve connection, the more you have a business, right? The more we elevate ourselves. And so that's, I think, how you have to approach every new problem is how do I use it to maximize connection?
Another thing that stood out to me is that you've been able to gain the trust of these very high performing, high achievement type of individuals, whether it's Huberman, Neil Strauss, or Hans Zimmer. How have you been able to establish that type of trust in them?
I think it's the incubator approach, which in some sense is like a parent. There are selfish parents out there and they think that who they are is reflected by their children. So they want their children to be perfect because then it reflects on them. Then there are other people that say, my children's success is my success, not because I did it, but because I love my children. And so when they're successful, I feel that I've contributed just by being involved in their life, right? And so by working with Andrew and helping Andrew achieve his goals or Neil and achieve their goals, I mean, I didn't write Neil's books. I didn't come up with the ideas that Andrew has, but by helping him, I feel like I'm contributing to the world, right? So I'm proud of their success. And I think they feel that. They feel that my success is helping them in some small way be with their success. And because of that, it's like a shared mission, right? Because their passion, they know that I have passion for their passion, right? Or I have passion for their passion about their passion. That is a better way of putting it, right? So, I'm not just trying to get a paycheck out of them. I want to help them make so much money that when they write me a check, they feel like they're very happy to do it. You know what I mean? That is cheap and well worth it. And they say a good lawyer is not a cost. A good lawyer makes money for you. It comes up with ideas, comes with directions that you would never have thought of that actually are worth far more than you ever paid them. And so that's sort of where I want to be in the universe. And maybe it comes back to me wanting to be the engineer designing space engines so that you have, science fiction like Elon Musk is doing, right? I mean, I think in some sense that drives him a little bit, right? The success of humanity is his success, right? That's why I think I connect with them because I truly want to help them.
You're currently sitting on the cutting edge of the intersection between media and technology and connection, right? And so you kind of have an insight into the future of what's happening, whether it's through TikTok or creators, brands, media, etc. What is going on today and what is the future going to be looking like?
We have two very interesting trends, okay? Maybe three. One is that we have so much information coming at us now that we don't quite know how to not lose ourselves in it. Information that could be right or wrong, or it could just be so much information that we don't know what to do with it. You open up Disney Plus and there's 15 different Marvel movies. How do you decide which one to start with? Are you going to watch all 15? How do you make it so that you didn't lose a whole week just to watching movies? Like, how do you not lose yourself in that information, right? Do you end up just watching TikTok videos? You never go on a date because all you spend your time watching TikTok videos, right? I mean, so one question is, how do we not lose the connection to ourselves through all these connections we're getting? They're figuring out how to tell their story in 30 seconds. That's so exciting, right? And we've lost the ability to have patience where you have a date and you spend days getting to know that person. Whereas at TikTok, they told me who they are in 30 seconds and it's exciting. So learning to be patient and the value that comes from building is something that's a little bit of a balance that we haven't quite worked out with social media, which is throwing so many things at you. Okay. That's one. The second one is that the role of sort of government and safety, right? I mean, all this technology can be poison, right? And what you see as a conflict between China and the US is actually a conflict of ideologies, right? I mean, the American ideology is let all the garbage onto the screen, all the ugly, you got your neo-Nazi, you got all these people with all the things. And where China is like, you know what, we want to protect people from the bad things, but sometimes the protection goes too far. Right. And so war of ideologies, and it's not clear one is right and one is wrong. It's probably somewhere in the middle, right? With the American system, it opens it up to hackers, right? And terrorists. The Chinese system, it could mean that if the wrong idea is at the top, then everyone is stuck with the wrong idea. And it also means that it stifles creativity to some degree, right? But at the same time, you don't have terrorists and you don't have bad ideas either, right? There's not just those two ideas, right? There's the Japanese idea, right? I mean, what you see on Japanese TV is very different. People self-censor. Right? America censors too. I mean, it's censored by what plays to the audience. Like if you do a movie about how bad America is, that movie isn't going to do well. So it gets censored in a sense by corporate greed, right? But the result is you get a lot of movies about how great America is. The rest of the world is horrible, according to watching American movies. And then you go to Asia and you say, oh my God, it's like stepping into the future. So we have censorship in a way, self-censorship through all these different systems. And it's not clear whether the French model If you go to France, all the movies are French on TV, right? Like you would not imagine there is German television or American television because you only see French stuff, right? So the competing ideologies about how information should be handled and restricted and who should have access to it, and all these self filters that are put on by these systems, we could silo ourselves and not realize it. Okay. So that's sort of the second area, right? And then the third bigger area is sort of like the future of humanity, right? Is virtual reality. If there is a point where I could put an attachment over my tongue and then whenever I taste just like the best steak ever, I don't need to spend $100 going to Wolfgang Puck's restaurant. I just put that attachment on and taste the best steak. I can go to Paris and not have to walk around and have dirt on the ground or spend 16 hours on a plane because the virtual reality is that good. And every restaurant I go into has no wait and the food is the best and it costs me $1. Why would I ever actually go to Paris when virtual Paris is better? And then one day you say, well, rather than have children, I could have virtual children. And when I put the program in, they immediately skip past ages 0 to 5 or 7. And I skip past the rebellious phase. And now they're all teenagers, full knowledge. I don't need to teach them anything. And then if they're arrogant, I press the button and they're not arrogant. And my digital children become my program children. I end up saying I want those as my children rather than to actually have people. And by the way, you see that. You see more and more people deciding not to have children, right? So more people playing with AI, right? And so we run the risk of becoming so impatient that don't have these hobbies. And that's why I do these things about one new hobby and it takes a full year before I judge it. You don't know the benefits you'll get from it in those 30 seconds of a TikTok. You only know the benefits you get by putting in the year, right? And so this is a piece that is at risk in this new system too, that is at war. What's interesting is that all those TikToks, they don't take 30 seconds to make, right? They take days to make. So some guy sits in the thing, does 19 different versions, edits it, changes the lighting, tries the music, syncs things, and it takes days to get that 30 seconds. And so, but it creates a culture of people that can only think in 30-second blocks. And so it's got something that's got to give in all these pictures, right? Some balance has to happen. Otherwise, we no longer have children. We no longer have freedom, or we have too much freedom. We don't have enough connection because our connection is only tasting the candy that was so sweet at that bite, but then can't live on candy, right? It will kill you, right? Too much candy will kill you. So this is where we're challenged in those three areas, the new technology. I don't know if I have the solution.
One of the things that I think meeting you stood out to me is that you're very intentional in standing out. Whether it's the car you drive, I think you drive a yellow car, whether it's the clothes you wear quite colorful clothes. I was wondering where that came from because we talked a little bit about perception. And so I was curious where that came from.
Oh, gosh, this is so interesting, right? So I was working for the web development company you mentioned, and unfortunately, it ultimately failed. But I had bought a house just before it failed. And so I found myself saying, okay, I got to pay a mortgage and I'm not sure how I'm going to do that. And I went to a law firm and they said, well, we'll hire you, but you've been a lawyer for too long. You need to come in as a partner and you need to bring $1.5 million in business with you. If I can bring $1.5 million in business, why do I need you? I would just take the money. Like, I don't need you then, right? If I had that, right? At that point, I was making $160,000 in salary, 2,000 something, right? And I was forced to start my own legal practice. This was probably the area where I had the least comfort zone. So I went out and just told everybody, I'm doing entertainment law. I worked for Hans Zimmer's company. It was just one employer. Now I'm open to work for everybody. And so a bunch of my clients were people I negotiated against on behalf of Hans, right? And by the way, Hans probably doesn't even know who I am because Hans is creative and he had a guy that was handling the business. And I worked with the business guy, Jay Rifkin, all the time. And Hans, I saw maybe once or twice. He probably wouldn't know my name, although I was like running one of his companies, right? But I went around and all the people, sometimes they said, we liked our lawyer. And so we're sticking with them. Sometimes they said, we like you better than our lawyer. We're going to use you. And that's how I first got my set of clients. And then people liked my approach and recommended me to other people. And then I just grew and grew and grew. And I said to myself, if I can go 6 months in a row and make as much money each month as I did when I had a full-time job, then I know I'm stable and I'm going to buy a sports car. And I thought that I would miss a month and then start the 6-month clock over again. I thought it'd be years before I would ever be able to buy this car. So 6 months later, I bought that car because I did not spend a single month missing. And that taught me a lesson. The lesson is when you stay within the system is just designed to extract the most benefit out of you and pay you the least. And so there's a lot of inefficiency in your system. Lawyers working for a law firm are making so far less than they could be working on their own, but they're afraid to leave. Accountants, anyone. So this says really that entrepreneurialism, this is why China blew up like crazy, right? Because people were so poor that taking a risk really wasn't much to lose. And then it was so inefficient that they became very successful. And then That's why you saw the big boom in Asia, and also why entrepreneurs do so well in a downturn. All the entrepreneurs fired from their job. They start new businesses because they have to. And then they find out, why didn't I do this before? Everything's so inefficient. So 6 months later, I'm going to go in and get that Porsche. I go in, I was going to get a silver Porsche and kind of fit in. And then I looked at it and I saw this Porsche on a spinning dais with lights coming on it. And I looked at it and there's yellow. And I'm like, Chinese color is yellow and red. This is like Chinese.
It was a sign.
I look at the label and it says Cayman. I'm like, Cayman is like a dragon. It's like a crocodile dragon. Dragon is like Chinese. And the dragon is the symbol of Chinese intelligence. It's not the symbol of power. It's a symbol of power that comes from hidden intelligence and sophistication, right? And so I was like, everything is calling out to me. And then I thought about it. I'm like, am I buying this car to fit in? Or am I buying this car as a celebration of what I've achieved? And I said, okay, I'm going to buy it. So I got this yellow car, and you think that people are going to treat you in a funny way. And people are like, oh, I love that. Let me talk to you more because you seem like an interesting person. So I started having a little bit of yellow to kind of represent, because it's my culture, but it's also a statement of my success, that risk taking is successful. And people said, oh my God, I love the way you dress. So I said, you know what? When I have a choice, remember I talked about choices? You could choose to learn the English curriculum or the Chinese curriculum. You make these choices. I'm always going to choose the crazier path. Go to dinner with the porn star and masquerade as her for a week and see how people behave, or sit with a bunch of other lawyers. So I've always taken the path slightly riskier just to see when I've gone too far. And I've never gone too far. I've never gone to a point where people didn't give me more benefits for taking more risks that says I should pull back. It hasn't happened yet. And so now read crazy hats, or I don't mind if my glasses are red, right? And so this is the one thing I say to people is don't be afraid to take a risk of being seen, and to do it in a way that feels like you're not ashamed of being seen. Be proud of being seen and being different and being weird, and go with it and see what it gets you. You can always pull back, but do it and be proud before you decide to pull back. And when you get too far, you could pull back. I haven't gotten there yet.
In the beginning of this podcast, we talked about your journey as a Chinese American, whether it was at Brown or UPenn, but throughout your career, you've also invested a lot of time into these Asian American organizations as well, whether it's General Counsel to NAP, the president of Montes SAID Science and Tech Association, and becoming the chairman of the LA Lodge of FF, which is a Chinese American fraternity. What kept you going in your career of investing in these organizations? And what did you get out of it? What do you get out of investing?
It's funny because Monte Jade Science and Technology Association is a Taiwanese association, right? And I'm not Taiwanese. Like, how did I get in there, right? You know what? Someone there took a risk and said, we want to be a little bit bigger in our perspective, right? And I think I mentioned how I view that that's an essential aspect of Chinese culture, is that there is a willingness to take risks and break the system. And that's why Chinese are all over the universe, all over the world, right? But at the same time, there's things that we love about ourselves, like taking our shoes off when we come in the door, right? Or dim sum, right? And so that there is an identity that's core, and then there is identity that is flexible, and we can have fun with it. And so I think I feel an affinity to that. And so I gravitate towards organizations that exemplify that. And I think FF is, for example, is the greatest example of that. So people who don't know FF, well, I'll tell about FF, is FF was a group that was formed in 1910 by Chinese that came to America. In most cases, I think of FF a little bit differently than maybe FF thinks of itself. I imagine a group of Chinese that came here or were sent here when Western technology was at its peak, and Chinese recognized that they needed to understand this technology, right? And so these are the people that are the most adventurous people that would leave China, go to a foreign country where they're going to be treated badly, and try to learn technology in a language and then extract some value from that. Then FF was this group of guys that said, look, we need to have some preservation of our identity as Chinese while we're also exploring this. And it's interesting that they formed a group of people called the Rough Riders, right? They were inspired by Teddy Roosevelt. What did they adopt? They adopted the most American of American, right? Teddy Roosevelt, a cowboy on a horse, go out there, take that hill, right? And to them, it spoke to them as Chinese, that this is the core of them, right? And so this is interesting, right? Because this is such a contrast to the way most people view Chinese. I mean, are risk takers, as cowboys on a horse, as rough riders. And yet this group of people saw that as core to their identity of being Chinese. And to me, why do I get involved with these Chinese organizations? Because it really is the core. that maybe sometimes we don't always recognize in ourselves. In FF, I think it's very recognizable, but even in FF, I don't know we fully recognize that this is actually the core of being Chinese, is being a Rough Rider that also has a sense of community and support, right? As opposed to a cowboy on a hill that may take advantage of other people, right? Might be a pirate. Okay. So our identity combines those two aspects, which in some cases are not always working together in other cultures, right? I mean, in pirate culture, they are the villain, right? In American culture, the cowboy could be the ones that oppress the Indians, right? But in Chinese culture is the brave person that stands at the top of the hill and proudly stands there when the sun comes up and doesn't necessarily need to be conquering anyone to do it, right? And I think in some way, when you look at how US and China are facing each other, you'll see that approach. America wants to send an aircraft carrier and put it right across, right in the Taiwan Strait. China does it and states its position, but it doesn't send aircraft carriers to the US. I mean, all these complaints are really still in near Chinese waters. You can debate whether it is or isn't, but it isn't across the coast of America. What did Russia do? Russia sent it to Cuba, right? So there's a very different approach. Chinese approach is to try to define itself very clearly in its own line and be comfortable with that. And despite whatever conflict with China or Philippines or with Taiwan, what I do respect is the fact that it comes back that they want to identify who they are and what their identity is, right? And what their core values are. And so at least that part, I think whether you're Taiwanese, Taiwanese are Chinese in the same way that that's what they want to identify who they are, right? Their identity is a little different than the mainland, but they're Chinese in the sense that they still want to identify who their values are and who they are, right? And we're all Chinese in that. We're all greater China, if you want to call it, greater Chinese in that way. So, okay.
No, that's perfect. So this is my last question before we finish. How would you identify yourself? You talked about your story, right? And we talked about your entire career journey, as well as your Chinese American journey, as well as kind of the core of the human connection that drives everything, right? And so how would you describe yourself and how would you identify yourself?
It's interesting. I mean, I think, interestingly enough, I probably would not necessarily call myself Chinese. I mean, this is an interesting way to think about it. I think I would actually think of myself as Cantonese. And in fact, when I think of China, I don't think of China. I mean, I think they're Shanghainese. Like, I think of China as like saying Europe. Like they're Germans and the French and so on. China is sort of a proxy for the fact that actually there's a whole bunch of individuals that don't think of themselves as the same people. I mean, it's easy to label ourselves as Han Chinese, but that's always been a creative concept, right? I mean, the government's created that just to tamper down localism, right? So on one level, I would think of myself as Cantonese, okay? But I also think of myself as not Hong Kong Cantonese like today. I'm like Hong Kong Chinese from the 70s, right? I have more affinity with what they were like back then than what Hong Kong is like now. So maybe I can trap a little bit in time. Then I'm like, well, maybe I should rise above about my ethnocentricity and I should be Julian. But then putting my name on myself kind of puts a bunch of limits on myself, right? Because it's like your family and your friends think of you, Julian. And so I think in some way I extract myself and say, I am an existence without a name. And this existence is exploring the universe and reinventing itself every day, whether it's a new hobby every year or a new connection to a new group of people. Like I went and started hanging out with a group of people that were fire dancers, right? I hung out with a group of people that were doctors who like to go to EDC. And through connection and through developing experiences, hobbies where you dig deep into something, I have an existence that is constantly remaking itself. And Julian is too easy to put a label on it. I think that takes away from where I'm trying to go in the universe. That sounds like a very fluffy thing.
No, it's actually very thought-provoking. A few things I've learned from this podcast. By the way, this is shaping up to be one of my favorites.
Oh, thank you.
It really has been. I mean, so one thing I learned was that all those people I was chatting online with that I thought were hot women could have been you. So that's one revelation.
And did it make it any less hot? Not at all.
No, I got the same benefit and value out of
right?
it. So
exactly.
Yeah, it was a connection. You're right. You're completely
Exactly.
right. And, another thing was just a huge reminder never to judge a book by its cover. I've had the pleasure of meeting and knowing you briefly and perhaps much more superficially than I feel like I know you now. And one thing I'm very impressed by this interview is just how much of a multi-level deep thinker you are. And it's really given me a lot of food for thought. And it's something that really encourages me to do my own self-audit, for one, and also to really reach out to those sometimes you don't know the complexity behind a person because you never had a chance or you never took the first step to reach out. And I feel like this has been an amazing experience here. So thank you for that. And speaking of, we talked about the choices that we make. You've obviously had a very storied career and sounds like you're doing things that you love right now in terms of work. Now, if there was a place you were trying to go in terms of what you wanted to do, is there something that you would, I wouldn't say rather be doing, but what is something that you love to get involved with or be like the next chapter or a legacy that you leave?
I think that as I get older, right, I'm actually in the best shape that I've ever been in. I did 7 years of martial arts and I studied Hung Gar, Northern Shaolin and a couple of other styles. I think I realized that there is a man body connection that you can only really recognize, whether you're taking judo, for example, or Brazilian jiu-jitsu. You can only get by deeply immersing yourself into it. And the problem is that to do that, you need a large time commitment and over a long period of time. You can't become a Brazilian jiu-jitsu overnight or even 1 year, right? I would like to explore some of those things because I don't know when I can learn until you get into it that deeply, right? I have some idea when I can learn just from having done 7 years of martial art. I'm feeling a little bit of my mortality. I'm feeling a little bit of 53. Will I have the opportunity to dig in that deep? If I could choose what I would do, I wish I was rich enough that I could then not have to worry about working. So I had the free time to dig deep into these things. Maybe this is how Buddhist monks become Buddhist monks, right? Like, how do they find enough time to sit and contemplate and get something out of it? And they say Buddhist monks are the happiest people in the world, right? If there is a place I'd like to go, but I'm not sure how I can go there, it's that just because of the time commitment and because of where I am in my age. But those are things I'm kind of exploring a little bit here and there. Look, Lee is back.
Yeah, Lee's back. Yeah.
There are like certain kind of general questions that we don't usually default to, but I just feel like Julian has such interesting experiences and thought. I was going to ask if you had any regrets, Julian.
This is very interesting. So the idea of regret has its own study, right? There were times I regretted and said, well, what if I'd gone to New York and worked for a big law firm? Or what if I'd gone and become an investment banker? And maybe I'd be, I'd have $100 million in a stable income just by going to Goldman Sachs after, instead of being a lawyer. Like, there are all these paths I could have gone and done differently. And as I thought about it, I'm like, each of those choices make you a different person. And you might be wealthier in one aspect, whether it's financial or romantic or whatever. There was a girl that I could have married when I was in law school, all these kind of things. I mean, we were dating for 6 weeks and she was like, why don't we get married? And I'm like, dating 6 weeks. So she says, you're Chinese, I'm Chinese. What's there to know? That was literally, she said that. And then my dad said, I think you might have made a mistake with that one. Maybe you should have done it because she would have made anything work and she was a nice girl. And I actually ran into her a few years ago and she was single again. And she kind of said the same thing. And she did meet someone who got married. And in some ways, I always think about that because she would have been a great wife. She would have been a good person, but it was a different path and it was the simple and easy path. And it just somehow didn't fit with where I am. Right. And so that made me think that's the answer. The answer is you have to have failure. You have to have things that didn't work out the way you wanted to learn. And this is the whole thing about failure. You don't learn without failure. And you are not pushing the edge of what you could be doing without regret, right? Like when you have a choice and then the choice doesn't work out, you don't know when you make the choice which is the right one. And only afterwards do you sometimes regret or feel you failed. So I'm going to wrap failure now as regret too, right? But you don't learn without creating those situations where you regret. There are times where I have acted less than I would have liked myself to act, whether it's morally, whatever, integrity and so on. And I think all those things are a lesson in humility. So if I've wronged somebody, it's a reminder of myself that you can't be perfect. You also have to learn how to forgive yourself. So there are things I regret, but I've learned not to regret, right? And that is also biohacking because if you let regret mire you into re-examining the past. Why do you regret? It's insecurity. Regret is insecurity. It's what could I do differently so that I don't do it again in the future, right? You do the same thing. The future doesn't necessarily behave the same way, especially in a changing world, right? So you can't have that mentality that when the rule change, I still keep doing the same thing, right? And that's where regret can hold you back. So probably a very unusual perspective on regret, right?
It makes sense. I mean, I think it kind of ties in thread that really I feel like is pervasive throughout this interview is human condition, human connection. And then what we are is really just amalgamation of everything, all our experiences, failures, successes, everything. And we really have to embrace that because if you don't regret your regret, right? Otherwise, you're just going to be stuck in your own head and life will just pass you by. And I think there's, definitely a lot of lessons throughout this conversation. That's definitely one that resonates with me.
Yeah. I mean, I think you have to keep regret from being backward looking and instead take regret and use it as a platform to build to be better. So whenever you regret, learn what it is about it that you didn't like and improve going forward. Keep moving forward, my friend. James O'Connor, he's one of my friends on Facebook. I reached out to him because he keeps saying, keep moving forward. Whenever failure you had, keep moving forward. Didn't work out enough? Work out tomorrow. Just do a little bit. Any little thing is better than nothing. And regret is the exact opposite of that, right? Which is that you get mired so much in what has already happened that you don't do anything different. So yeah, you got to biohack yourself out of regret, but not ignore it. It's important to know, but it's important to turn it into something you build on.
Is there anything else that, Julian, we didn't cover yet that you wanted to talk about?
Oh gosh, you know what? Will, this has gone deeper and touched more areas than I ever imagined it could in such a short period of time. Although I don't know if the watcher is looking at an hour and 15 minutes just saying this is short, but to summarize kind of a life, you know what? I want to thank you so much for giving me a chance to, I've always wanted to do this, kind of give like a little book or biography of myself. And this is a pretty good, a little encapsulation of that,
So how do people that are listening find you?
JulianChanLegal.com or Julian L. Chan. If you Google me, you'll probably find me pretty easily. My website is down at the moment, but it should be coming up as soon as the servers come back up.
Julian, thank you so much for your time. Yeah, it was amazing. Incredible story, incredible philosophy. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
Julian.
Thank you. I'll see you both. Thank you, Will. Thank you, Lee.
We'll see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening until the end. If you've enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. It'll help more people like you find us. You can find more about us on wild.show, WLD.SHOW. Please subscribe to our newsletter or DM us on Twitter. We'd love to get to know you.